The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty village of Al-Rashid as Sarah Mitchell adjusted her camera lens. She had been documenting life in this remote Syrian border town for 3 weeks now, capturing stories of families who refused to abandon their homes despite the growing conflict nearby. The 28-year-old photojournalist from Boston had always been drawn to places where hope struggled against despair, and Al-Rashid was exactly that kind of place. Dr. James Harrison wiped sweat from his forehead as he examined another patient in the makeshift medical clinic. The 45-year-old surgeon had volunteered with Doctors Without Borders for over a decade, but this assignment felt different. The sound of distant gunfire had been getting closer each day, and the local militia groups were becoming increasingly aggressive toward foreign aid workers. Still, the people needed medical care, and Harrison couldn't bring himself to leave. In the village square, children played soccer with a ball made of bundled rags while their mothers watched nervously from doorways. Elder Mahmoud sat under the old olive tree, telling stories to anyone who would listen. He had lived through 3 wars in his 72 years, and his weathered hands gestured expressively as he spoke of better times when traders from Damascus would stop in their village. The first sign of trouble came at noon, when Amira, a local teacher, burst into the clinic with panic in her eyes. She spoke rapidly in Arabic to the translator, who turned pale as he listened. Armed men were approaching from the eastern hills, she reported. Not the government soldiers they sometimes saw, but the rebel faction that had been terrorizing neighboring villages. They moved house to house, taking supplies and sometimes people. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she overheard the conversation. She had covered conflicts before, but always with proper security protocols and exit strategies. Here they were isolated, with the nearest military checkpoint 40 kilometers away over rough mountain roads. Her satellite phone had been acting up for days, and the village's only radio was an ancient device that barely picked up static. Dr. Harrison quickly began organizing the clinic's most critical patients. The elderly man with the infected leg wound couldn't be moved easily, and the pregnant woman who had come in that morning was showing signs of complications. These people needed immediate medical attention, but staying meant risking everyone's safety if the armed group proved hostile. The village elder called an emergency meeting in the square. About 60 people lived in Al-Rashid permanently, including 15 children under the age of 12. Most families had a few goats or chickens, but no vehicles capable of evacuating everyone quickly. The single dirt road leading out of the village wound through rocky terrain that would leave them exposed and vulnerable if they tried to flee on foot. As the afternoon wore on, the distant sound of engines grew louder. Through her telephoto lens, Sarah could make out dust clouds rising from the eastern ridge. She counted at least 4 vehicles, probably carrying 20 or more armed fighters. The sick feeling in her stomach intensified as she realized they were trapped with nowhere to run and no way to call for help. The villagers began moving their children into the stone houses that offered the most protection. Windows were boarded up with whatever materials they could find. Elder Mahmoud distributed the few hunting rifles that some families owned, though everyone knew these would be useless against a well-armed militia group. The atmosphere grew heavy with fear and uncertainty. Dr. Harrison made the difficult decision to move his patients into the clinic's basement, a cramped space that had been used for storage. Sarah helped carry medical supplies downstairs while keeping her camera ready. Even in moments of crisis, she felt compelled to document what was happening. These stories needed to be told, especially if something terrible was about to unfold. By late afternoon, the sound of engines had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even more threatening. The armed group had positioned themselves just outside the village, close enough to be seen but far enough away to avoid immediate confrontation. They seemed to be studying the layout, planning their approach. Several fighters could be seen moving through the olive groves that surrounded Al-Rashid. As evening approached, the first shots rang out, shattering the tense quiet. They weren't aimed at anyone in particular, but served as a clear message of intimidation. Women gathered their children closer while men took defensive positions near windows and doorways. Sarah crouched behind a stone wall, her camera capturing the fear in people's faces as they realized their peaceful village was about to become a battlefield. The leader of the armed group used a loudspeaker to make demands in Arabic. The translator explained that they wanted all foreign aid workers to surrender themselves immediately, along with any medical supplies and communications equipment. They also demanded food and livestock from the village, claiming it as a tax for safe passage through their territory. Elder Mahmoud stepped forward despite the protests of younger villagers who feared for his safety. With remarkable courage, the old man walked toward the edge of the village where the armed fighters waited. His voice carried across the square as he attempted to negotiate, explaining that the medical workers were helping his people and had done nothing wrong. The response came in the form of a warning shot that struck the ground near the elder's feet. The message was clear: surrender the foreigners and supplies or face the consequences. As darkness began to fall over Al-Rashid, it became obvious that the villagers and their guests were facing a life-or-death situation, with no apparent way out. The armed group had them completely surrounded and help seemed impossibly far away. 3 kilometers away, Master Sergeant David Cole lay motionless on a rocky outcrop, his ghillie suit blending perfectly with the desert scrub. The 34-year-old Marine sniper had been tracking the rebel militia for 6 days as part of a reconnaissance mission along the Syrian border. What started as intelligence gathering had become something much more personal when he spotted the armed convoy heading toward the small village of Al-Rashid. Cole had grown up in rural Montana, where his grandfather taught him to hunt in the mountains surrounding their ranch. Those early lessons in patience, camouflage, and precision shooting eventually led him to the Marines and specialized sniper training. Over 3 tours of duty, he had earned a reputation for impossible shots and an uncanny ability to operate alone in hostile territory. Through his high-powered scope, Cole watched the tense standoff developing in the village below. He could see civilians huddled in doorways, armed fighters taking positions around the perimeter, and what appeared to be foreign aid workers trapped inside the community. His radio crackled with static, but his unit was too far away to provide immediate support. Command had ordered him to observe and report only, not to engage unless directly threatened. The militia leader, a man with a thick beard and military-style uniform, seemed to be enjoying the power he held over the frightened villagers. Cole had encountered this particular group before during his reconnaissance. They called themselves the Desert Lions, though they were more like jackals preying on defenseless communities and humanitarian workers. Their leader, known as Abu Hassan, had a reputation for extreme cruelty toward anyone who opposed him. As night fell, Cole adjusted his night vision scope and continued monitoring the situation. The armed fighters had set up a camp about 200 meters from the village edge, positioning themselves to control all possible escape routes. They had brought heavy weapons including machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades, far more firepower than needed to subdue a peaceful farming community. Around midnight, Cole's blood ran cold as he watched several fighters drag a young woman from one of the houses. Even from his distant position, he could hear her screams echoing across the valley. The villagers who tried to intervene were beaten back with rifle butts. This was exactly the kind of escalation that often preceded mass killings or the execution of foreign hostages. The Marine sniper found himself facing an impossible decision. His orders were clear: maintain position and wait for backup. But backup was at least 12 hours away, and these people needed help now. Cole had seen what groups like the Desert Lions did to villages that couldn't defend themselves. By morning, Al-Rashid might be nothing but smoking ruins and scattered bodies. Cole began calculating distances and wind conditions while studying the militia's positions through his scope. The range was extreme, even for someone with his skills, but not impossible. The main challenge would be the number of targets and their spread across the area. A single sniper, no matter how skilled, couldn't eliminate 20 armed fighters before they began executing civilians in retaliation. However, Cole realized he didn't need to kill them all. He needed to create enough chaos and fear to break their confidence and force them to retreat. The Desert Lions were used to bullying defenseless people, not facing a skilled opponent who could strike from an unknown position. If he could eliminate their leader and a few key fighters quickly enough, the rest might panic and flee rather than risk staying to fight an invisible enemy. The sniper began identifying priority targets through his scope. Abu Hassan stood out clearly, gesturing angrily as he shouted orders to his men. The machine gun crews represented the greatest threat to the villagers if fighting broke out. Cole also noted the positions of fighters who seemed to be leaders or experienced soldiers based on their equipment and behavior. As dawn approached, the militia began making more aggressive moves toward the village center. Several fighters entered houses and began dragging out supplies and livestock. Cole watched in growing anger as an elderly man was beaten for trying to protect his goats. The time for observation had passed. These people needed immediate intervention. Cole adjusted his rifle and began controlling his breathing, entering the focused mental state that had made him one of the Marine Corps' most effective snipers. He selected his first target, Abu Hassan, who was standing near a technical vehicle about 800 meters away. The shot would be challenging due to the distance and morning wind, but well within his capabilities. Through his scope, Cole could see Sarah Mitchell moving carefully between houses with her camera, trying to document what was happening. He noticed Dr. Harrison helping an injured villager who had been struck during the night's violence. These were good people trying to help others, and they deserved a chance to survive this nightmare. The militia leader raised his weapon and pointed it toward a group of children who were crying near their mothers. That was the moment Cole decided he could no longer remain passive. Some situations were bigger than following orders, and this was one of them. These villagers had shown kindness to strangers, and those strangers were about to die because no one with the power to help was willing to act. Cole settled into his final shooting position and placed his crosshairs on Abu Hassan's chest. The wind was steady from the west at about 15 kilometers per hour. He made his calculations and began applying pressure to the trigger. In a few seconds, everything would change. The desert lions would learn that their prey had suddenly acquired a very dangerous protector. The morning sun climbed higher over the desert hills as Cole prepared to take the shot that would announce his presence and begin a deadly game of hunter versus hunters. He knew that once he pulled the trigger, there would be no going back. He would be committed to fighting alone against overwhelming odds to protect people he had never met. But sometimes that's what being a Marine really meant. The crack of Cole's rifle echoed across the valley like thunder, and Abu Hassan dropped instantly to the ground. For a moment, the entire scene froze as both villagers and fighters tried to understand what had just happened. Then chaos erupted as the desert lions scrambled for cover, shouting frantically to each other while scanning the surrounding hills for signs of their attacker. Cole had already shifted position before the bullet reached its target, moving 50 meters to a new shooting spot among the rocks. Through his scope, he watched the militia fighters panic as they realized their leader was dead. Several men ran toward the technical vehicles while others dove behind whatever cover they could find. The psychological impact of losing their commander to an invisible enemy was exactly what Cole had hoped for. In the village, Sarah Mitchell crouched behind a stone wall, her heart pounding as she tried to process what was happening. The sudden gunshot had come from somewhere in the distant hills, but she couldn't see any sign of who had fired it. Dr. Harrison grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the clinic, both of them moving in a crouch to avoid being seen by the increasingly agitated fighters. Elder Mahmoud gathered the villagers and urged them to stay inside their homes. He had lived through enough conflicts to recognize the sound of a precision rifle, and he understood that someone was trying to help them. The old man's eyes searched the rocky hillsides, wondering who their mysterious protector might be and whether one person could really stand against so many armed enemies. Cole selected his second target, the machine gunner who posed the greatest threat to the civilians. The man was trying to set up his weapon to spray the hillsides where he thought the shot had come from. Cole's bullet found him before he could fire a single round, and the heavy machine gun toppled uselessly to the side. The psychological pressure on the remaining fighters increased dramatically. The desert lions were now facing their worst nightmare, an unknown enemy who could kill them from an impossible distance while remaining completely hidden. These men were used to terrorizing defenseless people, not fighting against a skilled military opponent. Several fighters began arguing loudly about whether to retreat or continue the attack on the village. Younger fighter who seemed eager to prove himself grabbed an AK-47 and started spraying bullets wildly toward the hills. Cole watched through his scope as the man wasted ammunition on empty rocks and desert brush. When the fighter paused to reload, Cole sent a precise shot that ended his reckless display of bravado. The message was clear. Any hostile action would be met with deadly consequences. Dr. Harrison worked frantically in the clinic basement, treating two villagers who had been injured during the night's violence. The pregnant woman was showing signs of severe stress, and he worried that the shock of the ongoing gunfight might trigger premature labor. Sarah helped by holding a flashlight steady while the doctor worked, both of them jumping each time they heard gunfire from outside. The remaining militia fighters were becoming increasingly desperate and disorganized. Without their leaders' commands, they didn't know whether to advance, retreat, or try to establish defensive positions. Some wanted to flee immediately, while others argued for attacking the village to flush out any spotters who might be helping the hidden sniper. Cole anticipated their next move and repositioned himself again, this time to a spot that gave him a clear view of the vehicles the fighters would need for escape. He understood that frightened, cornered enemies often became more dangerous to civilians, so he needed to provide them with a clear path to retreat while making it too costly for them to stay and fight. 3 fighters tried to reach their technical vehicle to escape, but Cole's neck shot disabled the engine with a well-placed round through the radiator. Steam poured from under the hood, and the men dove for cover as they realized even their vehicles weren't safe from the mysterious sniper. The psychological warfare was working perfectly. The desert lions were beginning to crack under pressure. A brief radio transmission crackled from one of the technical vehicles as the surviving fighters tried to call for reinforcements. Cole couldn't understand the Arabic words, but the tone of panic was unmistakable. These men had expected an easy target, not a deadly game of cat and mouse with an invisible enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. In the village square, young Amira peered carefully from her window and watched the militia fighters running between positions like frightened rabbits. She had taught school for 5 years and prided herself on staying calm during crisis situations. But this was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Someone was fighting the desert lion single-handedly and somehow winning. Cole realized he needed to escalate the pressure to force a complete retreat. He selected a fighter who was trying to organize the others into a defensive formation. The man was clearly a sergeant or lieutenant, someone the others looked to for leadership in Abu Hassan's absence. Cole's shot eliminated him cleanly, leaving the remaining fighters without any clear command structure. The psychological breaking point came when 2 more fighters tried to flank around the village to establish a position in the olive groves. Cole had anticipated this move and was waiting for them. His shots came so quickly that the second man was hit before the first one had even fallen to the ground. To the surviving fighters, it seemed like they were facing multiple snipers or some kind of supernatural enemy. Panic finally overcame discipline as the remaining desert lions broke and ran. They abandoned their heavy weapons, their vehicles, and even some of their wounded comrades in their desperate rush to escape the invisible death that stalked them from the hills. Cole watched through his scope as they fled on foot toward the eastern ridges, stumbling over rocks and dropping equipment in their haste. The silence that followed their retreat felt almost unnatural after the intense gunfight. In the village, people began cautiously emerging from their hiding places, hardly believing that the nightmare was over. Elder Mahmud stepped into the square and looked toward the hills where their mysterious savior remained hidden. He raised his hand in a gesture of gratitude, though he wasn't even sure the person could see him. Cole maintained his position and continued scanning the area through his scope. He had eliminated 7 targets and forced the retreat of the entire militia group, but he knew the danger wasn't completely over. Some of the fighters might regroup and return with reinforcements, or other hostile groups might be attracted by the sound of gunfire. For now, though, the immediate threat to the villagers had been neutralized by one man with a rifle and the determination to use it. 3 hours after the desert lions fled, Cole remained in position, watching the village and surrounding area for any signs of returning threats. His training had taught him that enemies often regrouped after initial defeats, sometimes bringing reinforcements or heavier weapons. The villagers below seemed to be celebrating their deliverance, but Cole knew the danger might not be over. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the clinic with her camera, documenting the aftermath of the morning's violence. She photographed the abandoned weapons and damaged vehicles the militia had left behind, evidence of the mysterious intervention that had saved their lives. Through her telephoto lens, she scanned the distant hills, hoping to catch a glimpse of their unknown protector. Dr. Harrison worked to treat the wounded fighters who had been left behind during the retreat. Despite everything these men had done to terrorize the village, his medical oath compelled him to provide care to anyone who needed it. 2 of the injured militiamen were unconscious from blood loss, while a third had a shattered shoulder from one of the sniper's precise shots. Elder Mahmoud organized the younger men to collect the weapons and ammunition scattered around the village perimeter. They moved carefully, still nervous about potential booby traps or hidden dangers. The old man's military experience from his youth proved valuable as he identified which weapons were functional and how much ammunition they had acquired. From his observation post, Cole noticed movement on the eastern ridge where the desert lions had fled. Through his scope, he could see several figures moving among the rocks, apparently trying to maintain surveillance on the village. They were too far away for accurate shooting, but their presence meant the threat wasn't completely eliminated. The injured pregnant woman in the clinic had stabilized, but Dr. Harrison remained concerned about her condition. The stress of the morning's events had triggered early contractions, and without proper medical facilities, any complications could prove dangerous for both mother and child. He worked with limited supplies to monitor her vital signs and prepare for possible emergency delivery. Cole's radio finally crackled to life with a transmission from his commanding officer. The Marine unit was still 8 hours away, but they had received his earlier reports about the militia activity. Command wanted a full situation report and advised him to maintain position until backup arrived. Cole updated them on the morning's engagement but didn't mention that he had exceeded his orders by intervening directly. Young children in the village had begun to emerge from their hiding places, though their mothers kept them close to the houses. The traumatic events of the past day had left many of them frightened and confused. Amira, the schoolteacher, tried to comfort them by organizing quiet games and stories to distract them from the ongoing tension. Sarah discovered something troubling. While photographing the abandoned militia equipment, among the weapons and supplies she found documents that suggested the Desert Lions were part of a larger network of rebel groups operating in the region. The papers indicated they had been expecting to meet other militia units in this area within the next few days. Cole observed the village's defensive preparations through his scope. The men were positioning the captured weapons at strategic points and posting lookouts to watch the access roads. While their hearts were in the right place, Cole could see numerous tactical errors in their setup that would make them vulnerable to any returning attackers. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Cole's position, and he had to ration his water carefully while maintaining constant vigilance. His ghillie suit provided excellent camouflage but trapped heat, making the long surveillance session increasingly uncomfortable. Still, he remained focused on protecting the people below who had shown such kindness to foreign aid workers. Dr. Harrison made a difficult decision to move his most critical patients to a more secure location in the village's old mosque, which had thick stone walls and only one entrance. The building could serve as both a medical station and a final refuge if the militia returned in greater numbers. Several village women volunteered to help move supplies and comfort the frightened patients. Around 4 o'clock, Cole's concerns proved justified when he spotted dust clouds approaching from the north. Through his scope, he counted at least 3 vehicles carrying what appeared to be reinforcements for the scattered desert lions. These new arrivals looked better equipped and more disciplined than the morning's attackers, suggesting they might be dealing with a more dangerous threat. Elder Mahmoud had been watching the northern approach through old binoculars when he too spotted the approaching vehicles. He immediately sent runners to warn the other villagers and began implementing their hastily prepared defensive plan. The captured weapons were distributed to men who had military experience, while everyone else was directed to the strongest buildings. Cole realized he was facing a much more complex tactical situation. The new militia force appeared to include at least 30 fighters with heavy weapons and possibly military training. His earlier success had relied partly on surprise and the psychological impact of precise shots against unprepared enemies. These new opponents would likely be more careful and professional in their approach. Sarah helped Dr. Harrison move medical supplies to the mosque while keeping her camera ready to document whatever happened next. She had covered conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, but always with military protection or embedded with professional units. Being trapped in a remote village with only a mysterious sniper for protection was a completely different and terrifying experience. The approaching militia force stopped about 2 kilometers from the village and began deploying in a more organized manner than their predecessors. Cole could see them setting up what appeared to be mortar positions and heavy machine guns, indicating they intended to conduct a proper military assault rather than simple intimidation tactics. Amira gathered the village children in the mosque's basement, a cramped but secure space where they would be protected from small arms fire and shell fragments. She led them in singing traditional songs to keep their spirits up and mask the sounds of preparation for battle that echoed from above. The young teacher fought to control her own fear while projecting calm confidence for the children's sake. Cole began calculating ranges and angles for the coming engagement. The new enemy positions were at the extreme edge of his effective range, and the number of targets would make it impossible to neutralize them all before they could return fire or advance on the village. He would need to be much more strategic in his target selection and timing. As evening approached, the temperature began to drop, providing some relief from the desert heat. Cole used the cooling air to steady his breathing and prepare mentally for what promised to be a much more challenging fight than the morning's encounter. The villagers below were depending on him, and he was determined not to let them down regardless of the odds stacked against them. As darkness fell, Cole watched the new militia force through his night vision scope. These fighters moved with military precision, establishing defensive positions and setting up mortars with practiced efficiency. Their leader, a tall man with colonel's insignia, studied the village through binoculars while his subordinates prepared for what appeared to be a coordinated nighttime assault. The colonel had clearly learned from the morning's disaster. Instead of rushing forward, his forces were methodically surrounding the village at maximum range, staying outside the effective distance of the mysterious sniper who had decimated the desert lions. Cole counted 32 fighters with heavy weapons, including 2 mortar teams and several machine gun crews. In the village mosque, Dr. Harrison worked by lamplight to treat a young boy who had cut himself while helping move the captured weapons. Sarah documented his careful work with her camera, using minimal flash to avoid attracting attention from outside. The pregnant woman had stabilized, but Harrison remained concerned about the stress of another prolonged battle. Elder Mahmoud positioned his inexperienced defenders as best he could, but Cole could see through his scope that they would be overwhelmed within minutes of a serious assault. The village men had courage but lacked the training and equipment needed to fight professional soldiers. Their only real advantage was the stone construction of their buildings, which might provide some protection from small arms fire. The colonel's strategy became clear when Cole spotted fighters moving through the olive groves on the village's blind side. They were attempting to establish a close assault position, while their mortars and machine guns provided covering fire from the distant ridges. It was a classic pincer movement that would trap the villagers between multiple attacking forces. Cole faced an impossible tactical situation. He could engage the mortar teams to prevent them from shelling the village, but that would reveal his position to the machine gunners, who could suppress him with concentrated fire. Alternatively, he could target the infiltrating assault team, but the mortars would then be free to devastate the village's defenses. At 10 o'clock, the colonel's forces opened fire with a barrage from all positions simultaneously. Mortar shells exploded in the village square, while machine gun fire raked the buildings where the defenders had taken position. Cole was forced to keep his head down as bullets struck the rocks around his observation post, fragments of stone cutting his face and hands. The coordinated attack was overwhelming the village's hastily prepared defenses. Cole could hear screaming from below as civilians ran for better cover. Several of the village defenders returned fire with their captured weapons, but their shots were wild and ineffective against the professional soldiers who remained, hidden in the darkness. Cole realized he needed to break the enemy's coordination to give the villagers any chance of survival. He identified the colonel as his priority target, knowing that eliminating the enemy commander might create enough confusion to disrupt their assault. The shot would be extremely difficult in the darkness and under fire, but it was their only hope. Moving carefully to avoid detection, Cole repositioned himself to get a clear view of the enemy command post. The colonel was directing fire from behind a rocky outcrop about 900 meters away, occasionally exposing himself when he raised his binoculars to observe the battle's progress. Cole would have only seconds when the target became visible. In the mosque, Amira hugged the frightened children as explosions shook dust from the ceiling above them. One little girl asked if the guardian angel in the hills would save them again, and Amira whispered reassuring words while praying silently that their mysterious protector was still alive and able to help them. Dr. Harrison worked frantically to treat a village defender who had been wounded by mortar fragments. The man's leg was badly torn, and Harrison struggled to stop the bleeding with his limited medical supplies. Sarah held pressure bandages in place while trying to comfort the injured man, who kept asking about his family's safety. The assault team in the olive groves was getting closer to the village perimeter. Cole could see them moving between the trees, advancing in practiced formations that spoke of military training. Once they reached the outer buildings, the village's defenders would be caught in devastating crossfire between the assault team and the heavy weapons positions. Cole made his decision and lined up his shot on the enemy colonel. The range was extreme, the lighting was poor, and incoming fire was making his position increasingly dangerous. He controlled his breathing and waited for the perfect moment when his target would be exposed long enough for an accurate shot. The opportunity came when the colonel stood up to signal his mortar teams for a concentrated barrage on the mosque. Cole's bullet crossed the 900-meter distance in less than 2 seconds, striking the enemy commander's center mass and dropping him instantly. The effect on his forces was immediate and dramatic, as their carefully coordinated attack began to fall apart. Without their leader's commands, the various militia units lost synchronization. The mortar teams continued firing, but their targets became random and ineffective. The machine gunners ceased their covering fire as they tried to understand what had happened to their colonel. Most importantly, the assault team in the olive grove stopped advancing and took defensive positions. Cole quickly shifted his aim to the nearest mortar position and eliminated the gunner with a precise headshot. The second mortar crew immediately abandoned their weapon and sought cover, ending the artillery barrage that had been terrorizing the village. The psychological impact of losing both their commander and heavy weapons support was devastating to militia morale. Elder Mahmoud seized the moment of confusion to rally his defenders. The old man's voice carried across the village as he urged the younger men to press their temporary advantage. Several defenders moved to better positions and began returning more accurate fire against the disorganized enemy forces. The militia's assault team was now trapped in the olive groves without support from their heavy weapons. Cole could see them through his night vision scope, confused and leaderless, unsure whether to advance, retreat, or maintain their current positions. Their military precision had evaporated with their commander's death. Sarah managed to get several photographs of the battle's aftermath, despite the dangerous conditions. Her camera captured villagers helping wounded defenders and children comforting each other in the mosque basement. These images would tell the story of ordinary people showing extraordinary courage when faced with overwhelming danger, and how one person's intervention had given them hope. Dawn broke over Al-Rashid to reveal a transformed battlefield. The militia forces that had seemed so threatening in the darkness were now scattered and demoralized, their dead commander and abandoned heavy weapons telling the story of their defeat. Cole maintained his vigilance through the night, picking off any fighters who tried to reorganize or threaten the village. By sunrise, the surviving militia members had begun a chaotic retreat, abandoning their positions and equipment as they fled toward the eastern hills. Cole counted only 18 fighters remaining from the original force of 32, and these survivors showed no interest in continuing the fight against an enemy they couldn't see or locate. In the village, Dr. Harrison emerged from the mosque to treat the wounded from both sides. 3 village defenders had been injured during the night battle, but miraculously no civilians had been killed despite the intense mortar bombardment. The doctor's hands shook with exhaustion as he worked, but his commitment to helping anyone who needed medical care never wavered. Sarah documented the aftermath with her camera, capturing images of villagers embracing each other and checking on their neighbors. The relief in their faces was unmistakable as they realized they had survived 2 separate attacks by well-armed militia forces. Children emerged from the basement, blinking in the morning sunlight and clinging to their parents. Elder Mahmoud organized teams to collect the weapons and equipment left behind by the fleeing fighters. The village had acquired enough small arms and ammunition to defend itself against future attacks, though everyone hoped they would never need to use them. The old man's leadership during the crisis had earned him even greater respect from his community. Cole finally received radio contact from his Marine unit, which was now only 2 hours away from the village. His commanding officer demanded a full explanation of the previous day's events, particularly Cole's decision to engage enemy forces without authorization. The sniper prepared his report while continuing to monitor the surrounding area for any remaining threats. The pregnant woman in the mosque had given birth during the night, aided by Dr. Harrison and several village women. Despite the terrifying circumstances, both mother and baby were healthy. The villagers took this as a positive sign, a symbol of hope and new life emerging from the darkness of their recent ordeal. Amira led the children in a song of thanksgiving as they helped clean up debris from the mortar attack. The young teacher had shown remarkable courage in protecting her students, and her calm leadership had helped prevent panic during the most dangerous moments. Several parents approached her to express their gratitude for keeping their children safe. Cole began his careful withdrawal from the observation post where he had spent nearly 18 hours protecting the village below. His ghillie suit was torn and dirty, his water was nearly exhausted, and his body ached from the prolonged tension of combat. But the satisfaction of knowing he had saved innocent lives made every discomfort worthwhile. Sarah finally got clear photographs of the approaching Marine convoy through her telephoto lens. The sight of American military vehicles raising dust clouds on the horizon brought tears of relief to her eyes. She had been documenting humanitarian crises for years, but had never been so personally involved in the events she was recording. Dr. Harrison worked to stabilize the most seriously wounded militia fighter for transport to better medical facilities. The man had been shot through the abdomen and required surgery that couldn't be performed in the village clinic. Despite everything his group had done, Harrison felt obligated to save his life if possible. The Marine convoy arrived at noon, led by armored vehicles and followed by medical and supply trucks. Cole's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Martinez, immediately began assessing the situation and interviewing witnesses about the previous day's events. She was particularly interested in the precision shooting that had turned the tide of both battles. Elder Mahmoud greeted the Marines with dignity and gratitude, explaining through a translator how their sniper had saved the village from certain destruction. The old man's account of the mysterious guardian who appeared when all hope seemed lost became part of the legend that would be told in Al-Rashid for generations to come. Cole rejoined his unit and submitted his full report, knowing he would face discipline for exceeding his orders by engaging the enemy. However, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez privately commended his actions, noting that his intervention had prevented a massacre and maintained American credibility with local populations who needed protection. Sarah conducted interviews with villagers about their experiences, gathering quotes and personal stories to accompany her photographs. The people of Al-Rashid spoke with deep emotion about the terror they had felt and their amazement when help came from an unexpected source. Their faith in human goodness had been restored by one person's willingness to risk everything for strangers. Dr. Harrison coordinated with the Marine medical team to evacuate the most seriously wounded patients to proper hospital facilities. The pregnant woman and her newborn would receive additional care, while the injured militia fighter would be treated and then face questioning about his group's activities in the region. The official Marine report would describe the incident as a successful reconnaissance mission that prevented terrorist attacks on civilians and foreign aid workers. Cole's unauthorized intervention would result in a formal reprimand, but also a commendation for exceptional courage and marksmanship under combat conditions. Years later, Sarah's photographs and article about the siege of Al-Rashid would win international journalism awards. Her story of a lone sniper who risked his career and life to protect innocent people would inspire readers around the world and demonstrate how individual courage could triumph over organized evil. Cole returned to his family ranch in Montana after completing his military service, carrying with him the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for strategic objectives or political goals, but simply to protect people who cannot protect themselves. The villagers of Al-Rashid had taught him that heroism isn't about following orders, but about doing what's right when it matters most. Elder Mahmoud lived to be 85, often telling his grandchildren about the guardian angel who watched over their village from the hills. He never learned the name of the American sniper who saved them, but he never forgot the lesson that help can come from unexpected places when people refuse to abandon hope in the face of overwhelming darkness.